I am not, hi Dick. I am not smooth, but that's okay.
Desiree,
Hi Glenn. Okay.
Desiree.
I'm about to share some music and a picture.
Is that Glenn from Hofbarthelsen?
That is Glenn from Hofbarthelsen.
HB Glenn.
Yes. Glenn, I haven't seen you in 45 years.
Do you guys hear music?
Yes.
Do you see a picture?
Yes.
Great.
Desiree, it's Nora Jaffe. I just wanted to thank you for
Oh, cool.
letting us in with my husband, Harry.
Of course. Hi.
Thank you. We miss you in the pit.
Oh, well, please, if you can, stay the whole time because we'll talk at the end.
Okay.
Yeah, just.
Yes, your sound is better. Yeah, it's cool out there because I dug all the grass and everything up, so there's nothing to promote. Good thing I didn't put that stuff out Friday. Boom.
You could put in tomorrow's breakfast.
Hi, everybody. It's so nice to see everyone. Thanks for coming. I hope everybody is well. As we start, please jot down any questions or thoughts you have, because I won't really be looking at the chat while I'm talking. I've been so excited during this week, actually, for the chat at the end. So hope you all can hang out, and I look forward to this evening. All right, so Don Giovanni. Mozart was born on the 27th of January, 1756. He was born on the 27th of January, 1756, and he dies on December 5th, 1791. He's born 267 years ago, and he dies when he's 35 years old. For some reason, I find this astounding. 2.5 centuries ago, a guy lived for 35 years who changed all of the music in his own time and marked all of the music for the rest of time. And it's hard sometimes to remember that he was just a guy. He wasn't very tall. He was pretty slight in his build. He was blonde. He loved his hair. Maybe he was a little vain. He liked the finer things when he could afford them, but unfortunately in his life, most of the time he couldn't afford them. Anyway, Salzburg, where he was born, is part of the Holy Roman Empire in 1756. He's the youngest of 7 children, 5 of whom die in infancy. His sister Maria, nicknamed Nannerl, is a little more than 4 years older than he is, and essentially in his childhood, she is his best friend. His father, Leopold, is a sort of 2-bit musician, composer, teacher, 4th chair violinist, pedagogue. He writes a textbook, a violin textbook, which achieves some success in his own time. When Nannerl is 7, she begins keyboard lessons with her father, while 3-year-old Wolfie looks on. He starts picking at the clavier after she's done practicing, and soon he's making up little pieces. He was, as we all know, a child prodigy, competent on the violin, and extraordinarily gifted on the keyboard. Also, at the age of 5, he starts composing. By the way, I'm going to take a little detour here. When I say keyboard, keep in mind that the mechanics of the piano as we know it today were invented around 1700, so 50 years before Mozart was born. Before then, most keyboards, and during his time also most keyboards, were harpsichords. And the fundamental difference is that a harpsichord will pluck and a piano has a hammer. So it's the difference in hitting the string or plucking it. The other thing is that the piano that existed in Mozart's time was called the pianoforte, and it covers 5 octaves. The modern piano today covers 7.5 octaves, and this affects the tuning and the size of the intervals, frankly, in ways that I can't really explain, but Glenn could. The other thing I learned is that the word clavier actually only means keyboard, and it refers to anything that has a keyboard. So even an accordion could be a clavier. Anyway, Mozart played all kinds of keyboards. Soon, his father would trot Wolfgang and Nannerl out to perform in front of European royalty. He would make grand tours of Europe, including trips to Italy and France and London. During these travels, Wolfgang meets and hears music of other composers, as well as meeting the aristocracy and the royalty on the continent and in London. I'm going to show you a picture of him as a little guy. Can you see him? So this is Leopold and Wolfgang and Nannerl. She's singing. Leopold is playing the violin, and they have this traveling act that they go across Europe, and that's how they make money. The traveling is brutal. Often they don't have a lot of money. They have to wait for invitations from local courts to bring them in. They don't always get funding, and there is a lot of illness. Most of the time, it was only Leopold that took the children on these tours, although Mozart's mother does come along on some of them when he's really young. Trivia. In one of his travels, when he was little, he goes to France. He goes to the court in Paris, and he meets Marie Antoinette, and she's only 2 months older than he is, which I also find like where Mozart stood in history to me is, I always think of him outside of history. Anyway, besides France, they travel to Switzerland and London. Anyway, while traveling, he becomes completely enamored with musical theater because they would also go out and see things. And starting when he was a little kid, he had all these plots and music. He was humming. He was trying to figure out, opera plots. And he starts composing some bigger works. His first symphony is composed when he's about 8 years old. Apparently, his father wrote it out for him. And at the moment when it seems that Wolfgang has this incredible talent, Leopold sort of stops composing altogether because he realizes he can't compete with his son's talent. I have another picture of Wolfgang when he's about 13. So he is kind of a small guy. He's nice, small. He gets a job in the court in Salzburg when he's 17. And, he's a teenager and he gets restless and he starts to travel and he goes to Vienna and he likes Vienna and he decides to stay in Vienna. He loses his job in Salzburg. There was more to it than that, but that's the essence of the story. In Vienna, he becomes famous, but unfortunately not wealthy. He was famous because he would compose piano works, he would play them. He was composing symphonies and concertos, and he begins composing operas. He writes fast, and so he could write a lot. Chamber music, opera, masses, and lots of concertos. He begins performing and competing as a piano soloist, which does bring him some more money. With one exception in his life, Mozart actually never has enough money. And I'll tell you when later. During a trip to Munich, he meets and falls in love with a young singer named Aloysia Weber. I don't know how to pronounce it, but it's Aloysia. He meets her while he's touring, and he has to keep touring. And by the time he sees her again, they had sort of fallen out of love and she was married. But the short story is her little sister is Constanze, who is also a singer. And that's who Mozart ends up marrying. And they have, by all accounts, at the beginning, a very turbulent, passionate relationship. There's like evidence that they break up, they get back together, they're fighting, but they get married. And they go on to have 6 children, also only 2 of whom survive, 2 boys. In 1782, Mozart becomes interested in the music of Bach and Handel, who lived... Well, Bach is 1685 to 1750, so he dies just before Mozart is born. And Handel is also 1685, so really the middle of the last century before then. And he studies these Baroque composers, and he uses some of their fugal techniques in some of his later works. Notably, there are some beautiful fugal passages in Magic Flute and in the finale of Symphony 41. He also meets Joseph Haydn, who's a little older. So he's about 20 years older than Mozart. And the two of them become really good friends. Sometimes they play quartets. Haydn played violin and Mozart would play viola. Haydn was a huge fan of Mozart, writing to Mozart's father that posterity, quote, posterity will not see such a talent again in 100 years. Finally, in 1785-86, Mozart starts making a little more money as a soloist. He writes the piano concertos and he stars in them. He and Constanze move to a really nice apartment. He buys a pianoforte, a billiard table. They send their son to an expensive school and they keep servants. Also at this time, he meets the librettist Lorenzo da Ponte. They will go on, Mozart and Da Ponte will go on to collaborate on 3 operas, The Marriage of Figaro, Don Giovanni, and Così fan tutte. I'll talk more about Da Ponte later. I have to say this again. The opera Don Giovanni, which is still so current today, premiered 236 years ago. 236 years ago. This picture was painted by, I can't remember her name, but it was a woman, about 30 years after his death. And I like it because it shows him it shows his character. I like the way his eyes are not looking straight. I like the way he's serious. He looks like a person of stature. And he was a little obsessive. There's a story that that is told by a guy who played the violin in the orchestra at the premiere of Don Giovanni, that for periods in his life, Mozart would not speak normally. He would speak to the orchestra, he would speak to people in recitative. So he goes da 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 da. He would sing everything he was speaking, and his friend says how annoying it was. Anyway, that same year, 1787, so the year that Don Giovanni premieres in Prague, Beethoven, who was at that time was 17 years old, spends several weeks in Vienna hoping to study with Mozart, and no records survive whether or not the two of them ever meet. Towards the end of the 1780s, life in Austria becomes more difficult generally. The Austro-Turkish War means that a lot of the wealth and prosperity in the town in general is diminished, and the ability of the aristocracy to support music declines. So Mozart is appearing less frequently as a soloist. He sees his income decline by almost 2/3, and they have to move out of the city, and he begins borrowing from his friends. I read that there is a suggestion that maybe he was also depressed and his output slowed. We'll never actually know, because even with his slowed output, at the end of the 1780s, he composes 3 symphonies, 39, 40, and 41. He composes Così fan tutte, the last of the Da Ponte operas, which premieres in 1790. During this time, it seems that there were some wealthy patrons who decide to set up an annuity to support him, to support Mozart in return for occasional compositions for them. He writes Magic Flute, La Clemenza di Tito, and then he becomes very ill. Again, they don't really know what he had. He had swelling, vomiting, pain. I read somewhere there's a list of about 100 things it could have been, but he gets sick. He continues to work on his Requiem. And there's also some story that he didn't actually write the Requiem. He dictated it to a student of his. Also, there's no proof of any of that. He dies on the 5th of December, 1791, and is buried in a common grave. So what's meant by a common grave? It's still an individual grave. It's not a communal grave. But since he was not an aristocrat, he didn't have the right to have a permanent grave. Common graves were dug up after 10 years so that other people could be buried. And that was the common custom. That was very common. That wasn't unusual, and it wasn't an indication that he was, an outcast or poor. Or at his funeral, there are hardly any mourners, which also apparently is the custom in Vienna at the time. Although there is an account written almost 70 years later, so ask me how they know this, that Salieri, Sussmayer, von Swieten, and 2 other musician composers are there. Well, we won't know. And even though his funeral was modest and his grave was modest, in the time after his death, his reputation grew. There are tons of memorial services and concerts in his honor. And there's a real increased attention to his music that includes reissues of his works, and a complete edition of all his works is published. Okay, so that's Mozart. Da Ponte. Lorenzo da Ponte is an incredibly colorful guy. He is about 7 years older than Mozart. He's born in 1749. And he dies in 1838 when he's 91 years old. He is, and you have to listen carefully here, he is Italian. He's Jewish by birth. He becomes American. He's an opera librettist, a poet, a a Roman Catholic priest. His father converted the whole family in 1764 when Lorenzo was 15 so that he could marry a Catholic woman. Lorenzo goes to study at the local seminary. And by 1773, he is ordained as a priest when he's 24 years old. He writes poetry in Italian and Latin. He moves to Venice, where he makes his living teaching Latin, Italian, and French. And one of his surviving poems is an ode to wine. Oh, and by the way, while he's working as a priest in Venice, he takes a mistress by whom he has 2 children. And eventually he's charged with, quote unquote, public concubinage and, quote unquote, abduction of a respectable woman. He's found guilty and banished from Venice for 15 years. He moves to Austria, and through a series of connections, he meets Antonio Salieri, who introduces him to more people who help him find work as the court librettist in Vienna. Interestingly, and with few exceptions, Da Ponte's librettos are treatments of existing works. One notable exception is the opera Così fan tutte, which, and listen to this, he began writing Così fan tutte with Salieri, but he finished it with Mozart. And I don't know how that went. As an aside, there is also a piece, and I didn't look it up, but I want to, called Per la recuperata salute di Ophelia, for the health and the recovery of Ophelia, with text by Da Ponte and collaborative music composed in 1785 by Salieri, Mozart, and another composer named Vincente Martin y Solar, which I also think is really interesting. 3 composers collaborating on a piece. Anyway, Da Ponte goes on to write the libretti for 28 operas by 11 different composers, including 3 by Mozart, Figaro, Giovanni, Così fan tutte. With the death of the Austrian Emperor Joseph II in 1790, Da Ponte loses his job in the court, and being unable to return to Venice, he sets out to travel. In Trieste, northeast Italy, he meets the half-Jewish daughter of an English chemist named Nancy Grahl, who he would never marry, but he lives with her for the rest of his life, and they have 4 children together. In 1792, he decides to go to Paris with Grahl and their 2 children. But on the way, he changes his plans because of the unrest in France, because of the impending revolution. Instead, they go to London. In London, he has a series of odd jobs: a grocer, an Italian teacher, librettist. He worked in the theater and publishing. But eventually, he becomes bankrupt, and he decides to flee to the United States with Grahl and their children. In the United States, Da Ponte ends up settling in New York after a brief stint in Sunbury, Pennsylvania, running a grocery store, being a distiller, and giving private Italian lessons. He returns to New York, and in 1819, he opens a bookstore at 342 Broadway. He makes a lot of friends and eventually gets an unpaid appointment as the first professor of Italian literature at Columbia University, where he's not only the first Catholic priest to be appointed faculty, but also the first faculty to have been raised as a Jew. He introduces opera to New York and puts on the first performance of Don Giovanni in the United States. He writes a memoir, which I think is more adventure story than true. Here is a picture of him, and I like this picture. I like the character in his face. I like what he looks like. He becomes a United States citizen in 1828 at the age of 79. And 5 years later, builds the first opera theater in the United States in downtown New York at Leonard and Church Streets. Owing to his lack of business acumen, the theater lasts only 2 seasons before all the assets have to be sold to cover debt. And even though it burns down twice in the subsequent years, this house is really considered as being the predecessor of the Metropolitan Opera. It's opera in New York, and it was apparently a gorgeous theater. At the end of his life, Da Ponte makes his living as a grocer in Elizabeth, New Jersey. Nevertheless, when he dies in 1838, at the age of 91, there is an enormous funeral ceremony held in New York's old St. Patrick's Cathedral, which was then on Mulberry Street. Originally, he's buried in a Catholic cemetery on 11th Street between 1st and A. Later, that cemetery is paved over, and the remains of all of who were buried there are moved to Calvary Cemetery in Woodside, Queens. And while the exact location of his grave at Calvary is unknown, there is a stone marker as a memorial. I have another picture of him, which I like. I like him. He's got character. It's good. Da Ponte and Mozart write 3 operas together. After the success of The Marriage of Figaro in Vienna, they take it on the road. They go to Prague, and Prague is about 200 miles northwest of Vienna. And this is 1786, and the opera is a huge success in Prague, so much so that they get an immediate commission to write another opera. Mozart leaves it up to Da Ponte to choose the subject. And Da Ponte is interested in the Don Juan myth. It was a very popular story at the time, and possibly Da Ponte thinks it could be a moneymaker for them since everybody else is doing treatments of it. So Mozart writes the music for Don Giovanni in less than 1 year, completing it by all accounts the day before the opera premieres in Prague in late 1787. His overture is extremely unique for the time because he needed to make his mark on the market, so to speak. At the time, and since then, the Don Juan myth is popular. The story originates in Spain, and I'll get back to the overture in a moment. The story originates in Spain in the early 1630s, and there's lots of people who make versions of this story of a rakish guy who runs around and does what he wants. There were composers, writers, poets, philosophers. Molière writes a treatment of Don Juan in 1665. A guy named Antonio de Zamora in 1722. Goldoni and more. Mozart's Don Giovanni will go on to inspire works by Pushkin, Kierkegaard, Bernard Shaw, and Camus. That Don Juan myth, is also treated by Lord Byron and Richard Strauss. There's a movie version starring Errol Flynn from 1948. There's a version from 1973 entitled If Don Juan Were a Woman, starring, and you guessed it, Brigitte Bardot. There's also a treatment from a completely different point of view in 1995 with Johnny Depp and Marlon Brando. It's a unique version. Also, apparently, Don Giovanni by Mozart is Sigmund Freud's favorite opera. I don't know what to do with that, but. So in history, there are a ton of versions, and most of us know only Mozart's. Mozart and Da Ponte's version of Don Giovanni is a huge success in Prague. When they bring it to Vienna the following season, Mozart has to tweak it a bit. The tenor can't manage the original aria, and over the course of performances, other changes were made. I read about these changes a lot, and I can't keep them straight. So it's not, there were different pieces written to suit different singers, different sets, different stages, opera companies that had ballet in them. Eventually, it settles into the opera that we know today. Okay, so now we're going to get a little bit to the story of the opera. I read this next bit on Wikipedia, and I think it's so apt that I'm going to read it verbatim. Quote, Don Giovanni, a young arrogant and sexually promiscuous nobleman abuses and outrages everyone else in the cast until he encounters something he cannot kill, beat up, dodge, or outwit, unquote. And that seems pretty succinct for the character of Don Juan, but particularly in the way Mozart treats it. And it seems that Mozart himself he prefers a man who is sensitive. If you look at the opera Figaro, Figaro at the opening of the opera is measuring out a room to see if it's big enough for the bed to fit in with his wife. He's looking, and later in the opera when she is when she has, let's say, a Me Too moment, Figaro comes to he has her back. In Figaro, that's in contrast to the Count. The Count is an unfeeling, selfish guy, and that's exactly Don Giovanni. Don Giovanni is this bad guy, and I think that Mozart, in his heart of hearts, and maybe even Da Ponte. Da Ponte originally gives the title of the opera is not Don Giovanni. It's called Il Punito Dissoluto, the criminal punished, which makes sense if you consider that despite Da Ponte's colorful life, he did start out as a priest. So he has a strong sense of the good and the bad. And the opera, as it stands now, has that as the subheading. So Don Giovanni is the bad guy, but somehow in the course of the opera, well, I do sometimes see him as the protagonist. I feel like he's the guy, and he has a bad ending. There are people who say that really the three ladies, Don Elvira, Don Anna, and Zerlina, are really who it's about. Think about that, and let's talk about it later. So first, I want to start with an overview of the characters. So we have Don Giovanni, and he is he's a baritone. We have the commendatore, who's a bass. We have Donna Anna, who is the commendatore's daughter. She's a soprano. We have Don Ottavio, who's a tenor. We have Donna Elvira, who is a woman scorned. Like Don Giovanni, apparently 3 days before the opera starts, ditched her in a neighboring town. There's Leporello, who is Don Giovanni's manservant. He's a bass. There's Mazzetto, who is a bass. There's Zelina, who's a peasant, who's a soprano. And those are who makes the opera happen. The basic plot is Don Giovanni runs around, does bad things, meets up with somebody who ends up sending him to hell. At the opening of the opera, Mozart dispenses with the idea of a lengthy overture. So what I was saying before is, in those days, the overture was like a symphony before the action started. And most of the time, the music you heard in the overture, you didn't ever hear again. I think Mozart wrote the overture last because the music in the overture that starts the overture ends up being the music that happens when the commendatore comes back at the end of the opera. It's this foreboding sound of D minor. And I'm totally off script here. And there's rhythmic things. You hear dum, bum, 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 and you hear that at the beginning of the opera and at the end. So it sort of works like a trailer, like previews. But in those times, the composers would write the overture first. And Mozart changes this. He writes the overture last, and maybe that's why it wasn't finished until the day before it opened. And music is related. So let's listen to a little bit of the overture of Don Giovanni. Hear it? So it goes on. The overture goes on for just a few more minutes. As the scene begins, the first scene begins, we're in Seville. The whole action of the opera takes place over a 24-hour period. After the overture is over, we see Don Giovanni's manservant, Leporello, grumbling that he's stuck in a job he'd rather be free of. He says, "Night and day, I'm killing myself for someone who takes pleasure in nothing." Later on, Leporello will try and make Don Giovanni a better guy, but to no avail. Leporello is standing guard outside the commendatore's house while Giovanni sneaks in to have his way with the commendatore's daughter, Donna Anna. Within a few minutes, Don Giovanni is escaping from what might have been a romantic escapade, but we see that, in fact, under cover of darkness and wearing a mask, he has stolen into the woman's bedchamber. When she realizes that she doesn't know him, she chases him to the courtyard and tries to take his mask off. Her father comes down, and soon Don Giovanni is facing off against her father, the commendatore, in the courtyard, and in front of Donna Anna, he kills her father. She never gets his mask off. He escapes without her knowing who he was. She goes off to get her boyfriend, fiance. While she's not on stage, Leporello, who has been cowering and covering his eyes, he goes, "Who's dead? You or the old man?" So Mozart puts this serious music and this serious incident, and he puts jokes in it as well. Peter Sellers, the great American theater director, points out that it is genius the way the audience is immediately drawn into the action of the drama. No introduction or exposition in the music of the first scene, just within the first 5 minutes, the death of the commendatore. In the meantime, Donna Anna's boyfriend, her fiancé, Don Octavio, shows up, and she makes him swear vengeance on her father. Her boyfriend asks, "How did this happen, actually?" And she says, "Well, he came into my room and I thought it was you." She implies that there was an embrace. And Don Octavio doesn't really want to hear anymore. He ends up implying that as long as her fleeting passion for the dark stranger in her bedroom has not interfered with her devotion to him, he can overlook the fact that maybe she had been interested in, as they say, a bit on the side. So Donna Anna and Don Ottavio are hell-bent on finding who this masked man is. In the next scene, Leporello tells Giovanni, "Look, you have to mend your ways. You have to straighten up and live a better life. This is not going to end well." And while they're talking, they come across a beautiful woman who comes on stage singing a sad song of being jilted and seeking revenge. Giovanni starts to flirt with her, and then quickly he sees that it's Don Elvira, the woman he jilted, and and he is the one she is singing about. Don Giovanni sneaks away, making Leporello engage the woman by telling her of all Giovanni's conquests. Leporello has to keep a book to track all of his conquests. He says 640 Italians, 230 Germans, 100 French, 91 Turkish, and in Spain, there are 1,003. Elvira hears this and she becomes more intent on vengeance. later, Don Giovanni's in the countryside and they come across a country wedding. Mazzetto is the groom, Zerlina is the bride, and Giovanni immediately has his eyes on Zerlina and has Leporello take Mazzetto away and proceeds to convince Zerlina that she should marry him and that he really loves her and they're going to live in the big house on the hill. And she's swayed and she swoons that the nobleman would actually marry her. But in the middle of this seduction scene, Elvira shows up and she tells Zerlina, don't believe a word he says. And while they're talking, Don Anna and Don Octavio show up. And she still doesn't realize that Don Giovanni is her father's murderer. And Don Giovanni is saccharinely sweet as he tries to extricate himself from the situation. And after he leaves, Don Anna realizes, because she recognizes his voice, she knows that Don Giovanni is the one who killed her father. The three of them, Don Elvira, Don Anna, and Don Octavio, swear vengeance. So there are more scenes like this where Don Giovanni makes trouble, Leporello gets him out of it, or they evade taking responsibility. And Mozart and Da Ponte do a great job of, amid this serious stuff, occasionally putting some funny lyrics and some funny music in it. It's great. His sense of timing is amazing. In Act 2, Don Giovanni does a quick switch with Leporello. They switch clothes, they take each other's identity, and they both have low voices. Leporello is a bass, Don Giovanni is a baritone, but it's close enough. And Leporello ends up with those three and local people who they have enlisted to find Don Giovanni. Leporello ends up being trapped and beaten up by the mob. And then they see it's him, but it gives Don Giovanni time to escape. In trying to hide, Don Giovanni he wanders into a graveyard, and Leporello wanders in at the same time. And they hear a voice speaking to them. And it turns out it's coming from the grave, from the statue of the commendatore by his grave. Leporello is terrified, and Giovanni, rakish and believing himself impermeably, makes Leporello invite the spirit to dinner. So in the last scene, Don Giovanni is presenting a lavish banquet. There's a band who is playing popular music of the time, including music from Marriage of Figaro, which was the popular music of the time. Leporello is drooling with all the food, and he sneaks a bite behind his master's while his master's not looking. Don Elvira shows up. She tries to get him to change his life, and as she leaves, there's an ominous knock at the door, and it is the commendatore, and it's the same music from the overture. And along with those dotted rhythms that are severe as the commendatore's ghost walks in. One thing leads to another, and Don Giovanni is dispatched to the underworld. And at the end of the opera, all the other characters come on stage and they sing a sort of jaunty song proclaiming essentially that crime doesn't pay. This part always reminds me of a Greek chorus where people come on and say, okay, this is what happened, and this was the moral of the story. Some notes about the music. Mozart called this a dramma giocoso, literally a playful drama. I think today we might call it a dramedy. Most of the time, most of the music contains sad and happy music. The contract was what made the development within the piece. So most music actually during that time, you'd have a sonata or a symphony, and you'd start out with a major melody, and then there'd be a contrasting minor. So that was a common vehicle for music of the time, which to make contrast, you'd go from major to minor. Mozart begins with this notion at the very outset, the dramatic D minor, and followed by a lighthearted D major section as we see Leporello complaining about his life. Same thing with Don Elvira. Don Elvira comes on with a sad song, and it's immediately followed by this catalog aria, which to me, the catalog itself is sort of dramedy, because the subject matter of the catalog is actually not funny, but he has this book that has extended pages in some productions, but he has this book where there's all these numbers. I mean, yeah. So if you pay close attention, it's not just the tonality that makes these contrasts. Mozart also plays with the pulse. So he'll start out with a slow piece, and then in exactly the same pulse, metronome's marking stays the same, but the divisions become faster. And that illustrates the emotional state of the characters. It happens. It happens a lot. Just listen. And the thing about Mozart is that he wasn't just talented musically. He could write really fast, and he was really well trained as a musician. But he was also an astute observer of human behavior. He had a really good sense of human nature, and he could portray that in his music. And we see this in how he illustrates their emotional states. For instance, he uses the oboes. Typically, in his time, the oboes had a more commanding sound, and he uses them to portray Donna Anna's anguish. And he uses clarinets to show us Donna Elvira. Donna Elvira's entrance, she is, we usually see Donna Elvira as this screaming maniac, but she walks in and she's sort of sad and mute. And he uses the clarinets to show her sadness. And it's interesting to note that in all of Mozart's symphonies, with the exception of a revision of the end of Symphony 40, Mozart never has both clarinets and oboes in the orchestra. So I read this in an article by Daniel Barenboim on Don Giovanni, which you should look up because it's really interesting. I imagine it's true, but I didn't go through all of his symphonies and look at the orchestration. But it seems interesting that in this piece, he would have both oboes and clarinets in a way that was unusual for him in his time. Another thing interesting to note is that Don Giovanni is never given an aria by himself. All of his music is in concert with other characters. And it seems maybe that Mozart was showing that Don Giovanni is not the only meaningful character on stage, and that maybe we can only understand his psychological journey in this opera in his interactions with the other characters. And until the spirit of the commendatore appears at the end of the opera, everything in the opera has been realistic. It's been possible. I mean, all of the things, maybe coincidences that Donna Elvira walks in at that moment, but all of those things are possible. But suddenly, when Giovanni encounters the animated statue of the commendatore with his spirit and scary singing, suddenly that's supernatural. And I think it sort of is a bookend to the piece. And Mozart wants you to know that Giovanni has to pay, like from his actions at the beginning of the opera, at the end, he has to pay, sort of divine justice. A couple more interesting things, or all of these were interesting to me. I hope they're interesting to you too. The first performance was scheduled for the middle of October in 1787, and it had to be postponed twice because Mozart hadn't finished the music. So on the other nights when people had opera tickets, they just did another performance of Figaro. The circumstances preparing the opera were very trying. The singers were difficult, and technically things were a mess. The last scene alone, trying to find a way to send Giovanni to hell in the theater, made the entire project go way over budget. Peter Sellers, the great opera director, said in 1987, he said, "It was instantly one of the world's most volcanic masterpieces, provoking protracted debate on the questions of interpretation and social and artistic principles. It's clear from subsequent revisions that Mozart himself continued to wrestle with the piece." A few details from the original production in Prague, which was late October 1787, are fascinating to know now. The first cast was, generally speaking, or objectively speaking, very young. The first Don Giovanni, Luigi Bassi, was only 22 years old at the time. The first Donna Anna, her name was Teresa Saporiti, was 24. And Mozart chose to double the roles of Mazzetto and the Commendatore, which Makes sense because they're both basses, but it might have been confusing. Mozart himself conducted the premiere. The second set of performances were in Vienna in May of 1788, so 7 months later. Mozart oversaw this production, and he wrote some different music to help the singers. Interestingly, Elvira was sung by Aloysia Weber, his wife's older sister, with whom he had been originally in love with when he was a kid. The current Met production, which will be broadcast live in HD into movie theaters on May 20th, with 2 repeat performances on Wednesday, May 24th, is conducted by Natalie Stutzman and stars Peter Mattei as Don Giovanni. Personally, I think you should go just to see Peter Mattei. He's such a spectacular singer and he's an awesome actor. It's all like he is Don Giovanni. The production is a co-production of the Metropolitan Opera and the Opéra National de Paris. The production designed by Ivo van Hove, the Tony Award-winning director making his Met debut. His take is that Don Giovanni is essentially a sociopath. He doesn't set it in any time period. He mixes 18th century costumes with modern day styles. He wants the production to be as relevant in 10 years as it is now. The set is essentially a pretty nondescript street scene, and it's constructed in a way so that it can pivot and become different spaces, moving from open with the street to confined, as he says, like a prison scene. Also, a quick explanation. Most composers are cataloged by using opus and number. So for instance, in 1808, Beethoven writes 3 quartets that he dedicates to the guy who was his patron, Count Razumovsky, and they are referred to as Opus 59, numbers 1, 2, and 3. Mozart's works were cataloged by a man named Ludwig Ritter von Köchel, I don't know how to say it, and he was a scientist actually, and he was just really interested in Mozart. And so all of Mozart's work have a K number. Pretty much these numbers are chronological with few exceptions where he starts a piece and then he finishes or revises it later. His last ever piece written is the Requiem, which is numbered K 626. Don Giovanni is 527. And there's so much about Mozart that we still don't know. I try and picture him as a guy. So in the summer while he's writing on Don Giovanni, during that summer, he also writes the Serenade Eine kleine Nachtmusik. Bum, 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 like happy, innocent music. And the Violin Sonata Kerschel 526 in A major. Light, happy pieces during a time when he's grappling on how best to portray a sociopath who meets his just punishment by being thrown into hell. Anyway, a little bit of trivia. The Metropolitan Opera's first season began in October 1883. Don Giovanni opened that year in November. Since then, the Met has put up more than 575 performances of this amazing opera. Okay, that's all I got. Unmute yourselves and let's talk. Let's see if I can make this. First of all, thanks for coming, everybody. Unmute yourselves.
Brava.
Thank you. Hi.
Brava.
Thank you. Thank you. So questions?
Well, I have a comment.
Good.
My dad, who played the cello and loved Haydn, loved Mozart, loved all classical music, but he always believed that what we know, that Haydn was outshone by Mozart and deserved much more attention.
You know, maybe. I mean, Haydn wrote some very sensitive music. I think Haydn also wrote a lot of music. And maybe that's why we don't value him as much, because it's like diluted because there's so many.
Interesting.
I'm going to think on that because I do think Haydn was an amazing composer, but I just think that Mozart maybe did outshine him.
Okay.
So if Leopold Mozart was a two-bit musician in the 18th century, what's a two-bit musician today?
Me.
Oh.
Yeah, no, I mean, so he had, I mean, I felt kind of bad saying that because I thought, well, I was the fifth chair viola. He wasn't in the same league as his son. He wasn't
But no
famous.
one's in the same league as his son.
I don't know, Beethoven. I mean, you know, okay, so I'm not Yo-Yo Ma, right? And I'm not even the concertmaster. I am an average person who plays music, you know. And so
Average member.
it was unfair of me to say that about Leopold. It was not nice, and I apologize.
Apology accepted.
It struck me that the exclusion of clarinets versus oboes was not something that would have occurred to me. Was that a common practice among composers of the time, or would most composers have used oboes and clarinets in most pieces?
You know, I thought about this, and what I think is, in those days, in the orchestra, you had doublers. You had a guy who played the oboe and the clarinet. And so you never had them at the same time, because either one was playing or the other. But also, if what Barenboim said is true, that in the symphonies, there is either oboe or clarinet, then there wasn't that. It was that he made this decision not to have, you know, and it was curious to see that, because I think, is it that they didn't like the timbre? For instance, also, the trombone was just starting to happen then, and Mozart really didn't use trombone in a lot, but he uses the trombone in the graveyard scene off stage, and that's it. So it may have been that, you know, like today in a modern symphony, you really don't ever have a saxophone. You just don't. So it might have been that in the quality of the piece, you either had an oboe, depending on the mood of the piece, or you had a clarinet. I don't know. I'm going to look that up because I thought that was really interesting.
Desiree,
Yes?
how much give and take was there between the composer and the librettist?
Lots.
Well,
okay, so it depends on the collaboration. I mean, so what I learned in the course of, so I haven't done one of these in about a year, so sorry if I was rusty, but I remember reading that generally the process was, you get a commission, and within 6 weeks, the guy has to make the libretto, and then he gives you the libretto. And you have another 6 weeks to write the whole piece, or something like that. Something, you know, it had to do with the commission and how much time there was, and you had to write it for the specific theater. And I think that there were, for instance, Richard Strauss and Hugo von Hofmannsthal, they had a very good working relationship. And so you could say, I mean, I'm sure that Mozart said, so this is the music that I have for your words. And I think that the accent pattern in your words, could we find some other words? I'm sure there was a lot of that. But I also know that there were some collaborations for operas where it was not like that, where, and I can't think of who it was now, where they didn't get along, where I think Puccini had a couple librettists who just didn't like. So I think it really, I mean, I think that's like with any relationship, if you have a writer and an editor or something, where sometimes it's a good relationship and sometimes it's not. Nice question, though. Glenn, can you talk a little bit about the tuning on a piano?
My God, what do you want me to say?
Well, okay, so I read that the tuning on a modern piano, because it has 7.5 octaves, the
Right.
spaces between the notes are bigger or something.
it's not that different from an 18th century piano, but it does have more notes. And the strings are different. They're made of much more sturdy metal. And all the physics, like if you have a string of one length and you double it, then you get an octave lower. And if you half that length, you get an octave higher. But because the string has its springiness, that changes everything. And it's called inharmonicity. So you have to tune in a special way to work around that, to include that in the tuning, which means that the octaves become stretched. They go higher, the notes become higher in the treble and lower in the bass to accommodate that. And our ears like that too. It's like serendipitous that
I remember going to a lecture once at Bennington where, and I can't remember if it was he gave a lecture about how we hear things, and he was using artificial sound, and he would play one note and then he'd play another note, and he asked us, is this note higher or lower than the original note? And the audience was all musicians, and the response was half and half. Like half of us heard it as higher and half of us heard it as lower. And it was remarkable to me how your ear changes what's actually happening. So with sound that is natural sound, the sound bends. Like I can't tune to a harp, right? A harp will pluck the note, and by the time I hear it, it sounds like a different note to me. I just can never tune to a harp.
The pitch actually changes because it's plucked. It's at a higher tension when it's released, and then it flaps.
Okay, so but the notes, the sounds that he was playing in this lecture were not variable. They were computer sounds, so they didn't change. And maybe also I couldn't hear it because it was not what my ear knows. I don't know. Any other questions?
Sound is
sound is very well. It's your brain, actually, right?
Yes. Yes.
You know, for 12 years I was the assistant manager at the Met, and one of the things I had to do when I was the manager, when I was there alone, was I had to make sure that the orchestra and the audience was quiet before the conductor would actually walk in. Because, like, you know, it happens sometimes that the conductor is taking his bow and there's someone who is sitting in the front, you know, putting their coat off and sitting in the front row. So you wait till everything is. So I would tune in what I would call the gutter of the pit. So the pit was here, and there was a walkway that was 2 or 3 steps below it that you would walk in and you'd walk up to the pit. So I would stand there and wait to tell him, don't, or her, don't come in. And I swear that being that low and hearing the A from the oboe, because I would have to tune while I was in the gutter. So she would play the A, and I never had the right A because it sounded different to me in the Doppler effect.
Right. Yes.
Anyway, any other thoughts?
No, thank you, Desiree. This was so interesting and so fun.
Good.
Lovely. Can't wait to see it on the big screen.
Yeah. So May 20th, and I think, you know, check online, because here they, on the Wednesday, which is the encore night, they do two showings. So you can go on a Wednesday matinee, which is fantastic because there's nobody in the theater and it's quiet and parking is not a problem. No one's at the mall. It's like, it's great. So
when is that Wednesday date?
May 24. So look it up online, and you should be able to search for and by the way, people in Europe can watch this also. And I want to say thank you to everybody for coming. Hi, Sonia.
Thank you for all you do.
Hey, Paul Lee.
Hi, Eric.
Love y'all.
Love you. Thanks for coming, you guys. I'll put this online in a couple
Great.
days. And Nora,
Great.
wait, hold on, Nora. So
I'll wait.
Nora, Nora's
Yeah.
older sister, younger sister, older
Younger
sister,
sister.
younger sister
I know.
played in a quartet with me. And you'll like this, Janet. Janet left. Oh, no, she's there. We were called
Not here.
We were called the Sunrise Quartet because the Sunrise Quartet is a quartet by Haydn. So when I was 11, 12, and 13, Nora's sister and I played in a quartet.
Oh, of course you did. And I love Haydn as well.
So Nora, nice to see you. When are you going?
What a treat. We're going in a little bit before the screening.
Good.
We just got tickets last week. So when Vera said, boy, I don't know if you know Desiree hosts a salon, and I think she'd probably be pleased to have you.
Absolutely.
What a treat.
Perfectly
timed.
If you want, I'll put it on, I'll put you on my mailing list. But,
Please do.
and Peter Mattei and the rest of the cast looks young. I don't know them. And I don't
He has
know.
the most remarkable voice. Oh my God.
He's
So
such a nice
beautiful.
guy. They're one of, like, years ago, 10 years ago, maybe, one of the women in the section was turning 50 and she's happily married, but she had an incredible fan crush on him. And so we went up to his dressing room once and said, hey, we'd like to surprise our friend. Will you come out to dinner with us? And he's like, yes. He says, I'm here usually drinking beer, eating chips in my hotel room all alone. So yes, I love it. So he went out with 8 women and he was so charming. He was so nice. I actually reached out to him for this to see if he would make a little clip and I never heard back, but I heard from his agent. So I'm sure he's just really busy, but he is fantastic.
I can't wait to see it. And
Good.
this was just a wonderful warm up. Thank you so much.
You know what? If you would send me an email so that I can connect with you, that would be great. I'd love to know what you're doing. Okay, good.
I will.
All right.
Absolutely.
Goodbye, everybody. Thank you for coming.
Bye.
Stay well.
Thank you, Desiree. Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Goodbye, Desiree.
Bye. Oh, Stephen, I didn't see your picture.
Yes.
Thank you for coming.
Okay, I had a few comments. Number one, I thoroughly enjoyed it because I thoroughly enjoy Mozart and I thoroughly enjoy Don Giovanni. I saw the Peter Sellers, I think that was in the early 80s.
Yep.
Or something like that. And then there was one that was set in the Bronx, as I recall. Okay, so Don Giovanni is one of my all-time favorites. I don't know if you read that wonderful biography of his. I texted you the cover. Okay, which I read about a year, 2 years ago. Wonderful book if you haven't read a biography, a full biography of this extraordinary man, and you really did him justice. Just an amazing man.
I mean, he was all over the map, but he was a loose cannon, but he was amazing.
And he wrote arguably 3 of the greatest operas, the librettos. And so one of my comments was that in this book, it describes how he and Mozart instantly bonded. Yeah. And that those 3 operas could only have been done in that way.
Yeah.
Right. So that was one comment that I had. And the last comment I would make, it was very interesting when you were talking with the pianist about the piano and the relative sounds. Okay. And that is, as you well know, that music is the most abstract of art forms. It all takes place between the ears of the listener. Okay. So it doesn't surprise me that individual strings or individual, strings plucked might sound different. Okay. Because it is the most abstract of art forms. You're at a pay grade above me, you understand, Desiree, but
listen, I'm going to go because how wonderful it was that you would go to the opera with my father and that the 2 of you would sit there and love Mozart together. That was really, really, really great.